Well, hello and welcome to the Being Formed podcast. My name is Adam. I'm the host of the show, and it's great to have you with us. You know, I've been noticing something lately, both in my own life and in the lives of the people I walk with. It's how easy it is for our relationship with God to become something that mostly lives in our thoughts, in what we know, what we believe, what we're trying to understand. Yet, our actual lives are lived somewhere else, in our bodies, in our movement, in the way we experience each moment as it comes. So I've been wondering, what might it look like to become more aware of God there? Not just in our thinking, but in our living. My guest today is Deborah Gregory. She's a spiritual director, retreat leader, and the author of a new book called Spiritual Wayfinding. And in her work, she's helping people rediscover a more embodied way of being with God, one that brings together attentiveness, movement, and the wisdom of the body. This is a conversation about learning to notice God in ways that are often overlooked, not by striving harder, but by becoming more present to what's already happening within us and around us. I'm really grateful for this conversation. I think it's one that might stay with you too. Welcome to the Being Formed podcast. Deb Gregory, it's so good to have you with us today. How are you doing?
Thanks, Adam. I am really happy to be here. This is a delight.
Wonderful to have you with us. And we were talking before we hit record. I've heard your name around a lot in spiritual direction circles. And so I think this is the first time we've actually had a chance to meet, actually. And so, yeah, I'm filled with all kinds of delight just to see you. And I'm really looking forward to getting to hear your story and to hear about your book. So thank you again just for being with us.
Thank you.
I want to begin with a question I ask all the guests on our show, and it's a little bit deeper than how are you doing. If I may just ask you, how is it with your soul, Deb?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, and I love that turn of phrase. I have a difficult relationship with my soul in the sense of how I used to think about it was really a disembodied way of thinking of soul, right? And so I've been trying to reconnect it to my body, and part of that process for me is kind of reconnecting it to that Hebrew word nefesh. It's kind of the most basic level of soul. And the way I think of it is nefesh is about aliveness and animation. And so I'm feeling aliveness right now because I've got this book coming out in a month. And so I feel all the different variations of aliveness, both the good and the bad. I also feel alive because I live in it. I went for a walk this morning. I live in a subdivision in Florida that's overdeveloped. So we live with the wildlife and we have wild turkeys. And last week when I was out for a walk, I got attacked and chased by a wild turkey.
You did.
And I did. It was terrifying. I had no idea because they're almost as tall as I am. And so luckily a neighbor came out with his broom and shooed it away, but like it flapped the phone out of my hand. It was chasing me down the road.
Whoa.
So I've learned, not to mess with the wild turkey. So I dug out my Nordic walking poles, and now that's my new form of walking during this turkey season. And it was good too, because they came at me again today, but I had my poles. Yes. So it's just a different level of aliveness. And I think, and the deeper part for me is kind of noticing, especially with the book coming out, I'll just talk freely here, that there's the consolations of it, but I'm also feeling those moments of desolation. And desolation is where, we feel those attacks of the enemy into those very vulnerable places in our story. And so I think on some level, the wild turkey have helped me process, like, just this recognition of my own sense of vulnerability
That's right.
and, where I feel the desolation, creeping in because it's so subtle. You live with it all the time. You don't expect, when it will attack you. So that's kind of the aliveness that I'm coming
Mhm.
with today. Just this recognition of my own interior movements in this season.
I love it. Wow. Off to a great start already. So gonna love this conversation. So the book is called Spiritual Wayfinding. The subtitle is 33 Walking Meditations for Navigating Life with Embodied Wisdom. And that's set to be released when? In April, right? Yeah.
Yes, April 14.
April 14th, 2026. And you're going to want this book, everybody. I've got it in my hands. It's a wonderful sized book that I think was intentionally designed to
Yes.
go with you, to be put in your
Yeah.
backpack as you're walking, right? And so we're
Mhm.
going to talk about what is in this book. But before we do, would love to begin just with your story, Deb. How did you first come to notice that that your body was actually part of your life with God?
This a long journey.
Mhm,
So, I guess the most important moment for me was when I began a process of training to become a spiritual director.
mm,
And in that first year of studies, we were encouraged to pick a spiritual practice that we would do regularly through that course, maybe that year, maybe the 2 years of the program. And so I had just discovered that I identify as an Enneagram 5, which
mhm,
is probably the most disembodied of the types.
mm,
And I really have,
mm.
I'm the sort of person where, if my husband would rub my feet at the end of the day, I would say, "Thank you for reattaching my feet." Like I just didn't even notice that they were there.
Yeah.
So I recognized through discovering more about myself just how disembodied I am. And so one of the practices I chose was to walk a labyrinth
Mm,
every day.
mm,
And that became, and not every day, every week. So
mm,
every week I would go and we had one in our town and I would begin to walk the labyrinth. And that became such an important practice for me
mhm,
to connect um, my body and my emotions and my spiritual life together. And it just happened, I didn't really put a lot of thought into what was happening. I just did it because I knew it was good for me. So
mhm,
that was maybe the beginning of this journey for me.
mhm. Yeah. Well, you mentioned in your book early on that also this book emerged from relearning how to walk after an
Yes.
injury, after an ankle injury. And so that was very formative as well. Yeah. I'm curious, what was God forming in you in that season that I guess you wouldn't have learned any other way?
Yeah. Thank you. That's a great question. Yeah. The irony of this book is that it emerged out of a season when I couldn't walk.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
so, as I mentioned, I began years ago this walking practice in the labyrinth, and then during COVID, like so many of us, we had to get out of the house, and so
Mhm.
many of us rediscovered a love for walking.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until we moved to Florida, and it was a really quick, sudden move. We weren't
Mm.
expecting it. Moved here, got settled, and right away, I broke my ankle just walking down the street on a sidewalk like so many people do,
Mm.
this little lip hidden in the shadows. And I am not, I don't want to get too graphic here, but I heard the snap. I felt it
Mhm.
in my body and I felt everything in my body.
Mm.
And that, everything I needed to know was in my body, not my
Yeah.
mind
Yes. Yes.
in that moment. And so that began a journey for me of relearning how to walk. And I had to ask this question: Is there something I can learn about walking with God, not just
Mhm.
as a metaphor, but
Mhm.
what can I actually learn about walking with God through relearning how to walk? And it was a really slow process for me. I some people heal really quickly. It took me 6 months before I could walk without pain. And the irony, again, the beauty is that 6 months later, the first steps that I took without pain were in a labyrinth in the Chartres Cathedral in France, one
Mm.
of the oldest remaining labyrinths in the world. And the feel of the cold stone, I can still remember this sensation because I took my shoes off and I walked slowly. The sensation of the cold stone under my feet, just that sense of the darkness in the room and the light coming through the windows with all these saints and people faces, looking in and observing my journey and this destination of so many pilgrims and their stories coming together in this place were really profound. So it was very remarkable that that's what happened in me
Mm.
in that labyrinth.
Wow. Yeah. I loved watching you just describe that with your eyes closed and kind of really going there in your imagination and that sense of your body even being with you in that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. And you know what I learned? I was reflecting on this morning. I know that you've walked the Camino, and I've heard from other people who've walked the Camino that there's different levels of pain, but some people notice that the level of pain that you're bringing in emotionally or in your life that you have to sort through
Mhm.
often comes out in the pain in your feet and in your body. And I recognize that. I mean, this is one of the most ancient theories
Mm.
of people, across the world is that healing begins with the feet. And and in some ways, as I reflect back on that experience in the Chartres Labyrinth, you know, perhaps the reason why it took me so long to heal, longer than most people, for, just a simple fracture, was because there was more that I needed to heal than just my feet. And
Mm.
so the whole process was engaging a deeper level of healing throughout my whole system, right?
Mm.
So that's what
Mhm.
that's the story that's making the most sense to me at
Mm.
this point.
Boy, I was not intending to go here at all, but you just brought something up, a memory of mine. Um, I'd been in ministry for years, Deb, as kind of a worship pastor, ordained pastor, local church context for a long, long time, and had really never done anything kind of cross cultural missions related. And I just so happened to be at a worship conference in Kansas City and saw a video. Um, and it was for an organization called Souls for Souls.
Yes.
And they would go
Okay.
into places where there are hurricanes or tragedy of some kind and bring shoes into these places for children. And the video showed this volunteer team uh, uh, washing kids' feet and then putting these shoes on their feet. And something just came over me, like God was just saying that is the thing that you can do. Like,
What?
you're not going to go build a house. You're going to go and just wash feet. And I had that connection. I remember of just being like, well, that's what Jesus did, and I would even think about that,
Yes.
like the healing begins in the feet. Like,
Yes.
what's up with
Oh,
that?
wow.
um,
Yeah.
what was needing to be healed even in the disciples there in the upper room. But I saw that humility of Jesus, and then I was just like, that's it, that's what's going to happen. And long story, incredible story, a total miracle thing. My wife and I ended up in Haiti, and I remember the team, it was the Souls for Souls team, and they were saying, okay, well, we're going to divvy up the responsibilities. Okay, who wants to wash the kids' feet? And my hand was up, and I was like, that's all I want to do,
That's
So,
me.
but the thing is, that's how like the world opened up to me all the way up until this last year, walking the Camino and being really, really getting to experience this more full understanding of my own body and my soul connection in that. So, and of course, my life has not been the same since. So, anyway, thank you for that.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a great story. Yeah,
Mm.
I had forgotten all about that organization. I had heard about them years ago. So thanks for reigniting that for me as well.
Um, okay, back to you, back to your book. There's
Back to
another
our feet.
theme. There's another theme here going on too. And you're talking early on about these walks that you'd have with your daughters,
Mhm.
and learning from their embodied ways of engaging the world, and some aspects of neurodiversity here. So can you say more about how uh, what your daughters have taught you and helped reshape your understanding of spirituality?
Absolutely. They have taught me so much. My daughters, and I think children are the best spiritual teachers if we can slow down and listen
Mm.
to them. And so, as I was relearning to walk, my daughters would often like to come walk with me. And eventually it became one of my daughters, my oldest daughter. She's now in high school, but most of this was written when she was in middle school. And she identifies as neurodivergent, which is kind of an umbrella term for differences in the way in which our bodies and our minds process sensory, emotional,
Mhm.
and the way we move through the world. And so her story, which I won't say much about because she gives me only a little bit of permission,
Mhm.
and the permission is I can share that she's neurodivergent, and sensory processing is a big part of our family story from ever since she was little. And so she has opened up for me new ways to look at the world and experience the sensory system
Mhm.
in the slow movements of walking. And it for me, it just brought all the insights that I think we've lost, but that God has already instilled into us, the wisdom of our
Mhm.
bodies. I mean, what is our sensory system for? It's actually to help us discern how we are in the world, right?
Mhm.
It helps us discern this is good or bad by smell, or help us discern, safety by touch. So much of our discernment is already happening in our sensory system, um, and we're just not really paying attention to it. But when your sensory system is overtaxed or overwhelmed, then it impacts our emotional system, right?
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
one of the things that I had learned through all these years of therapy with her is just how important the vagus nerve is. It's kind of
Mhm.
that central highway in
Mhm.
our bodies that connect both the sensory and the emotional inputs and help us process them and make sense of them and connect them to our mind and our brain. And so walking um, wasn't just like an activity that I did before without thinking about it. Now I was beginning to actually have some awe and wonder at what was happening.
Mhm.
You know, walking engages both sides of the body, both sides of the brain. That's also really important for regulation and calming us down and making us open.
Mhm.
And so, through walking with my daughter, she helped me just regain awareness of the amazing design of our sensory system, our
Mhm.
emotions, how we think, our desires, like all of that work that God instilled in our bodies to do discernment. And
Hmm.
so this really is a discernment guide,
Uh-huh.
because each part of the book walks through a different aspect. There's all the senses, there's all the emotions, there's different ways of thinking, there's different desires. And each meditation helps us to kind of slow down and notice what's happening
Mhm.
uh, in the journey.
Can you say more about how our bodies contain wisdom that I think can help us in our discernment? Like that might be a new concept for some people.
Yeah, absolutely. When we use the word discernment, a lot of times we attach it to the idea of decision making,
Yeah.
right? I have to make a decision, so I'm entering discernment. But
Mhm.
the reality is we make something like 30,000 decisions a day. So
Mhm.
we're always
Mhm.
making little decisions. But discernment um, it actually has less to do with like the end decision that we make. It's more about noticing what's happening right
Mm.
now. And when we talk
Mhm.
about spiritual discernment, we're not really talking about like, what is God calling me to do with my life?
Mhm.
we're
Mhm.
actually we're honing in on how is God walking with me right
Mhm.
now? What am I noticing about my interior movements? What brings me joy? What brings me pain? What brings up, what brings up disgust? We never talk about disgust as a spiritual emotion, but it guides us like a rudder under the
Mm.
waterline,
Mhm.
right? Disgust is so powerful. But if we step back and explore how is disgust moving me today in my life, um, then we begin to discern, is this the way that God wants me to move? Or is this just out of comfort or, out of my own fear?
Mhm.
So discernment really becomes about examining our interior state right now with God. Am I moving towards God or am I moving away from God? And
Mhm.
so we notice those things not in our mind, but we notice them in the affective nature of our bodies,
Mhm.
in the way that we feel about things and our sensations,
Mhm.
in the way that our thoughts are, the texture of our thoughts, all of those things, our desires. So, so I think discernment really is paying attention to all of that and noticing what is the work it's doing um, in
Mhm.
the process of walking with God.
Mhm. Walking with God. I
Mm.
love already at the beginning of your book how you talk about how, you used to there was a time where your walk with God would have been how you sat down and read scripture and
Yes.
maybe wrote in a journal or prayed, right? And then you were like,
Yes.
what if that's more than that, right? Yeah, I
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah. What if it's not meant to be a metaphor? And you look back
Yeah.
at scripture, everybody was walking. God
Mhm.
was calling people to walk. I mean, they were walking in the wilderness all those years.
Mhm.
Moses was walking, Abraham was walking, and Jesus was walking.
Mhm.
His disciples were
Yeah.
walking with him. So, walking um, actually
Mm.
is the way theology happened
Mhm.
and the way discipleship happened. And
Mm.
in our sedentary, studious, post enlightenment kind of way
Mhm.
of engaging spirituality, we've lost a lot of that.
Yeah, um, like spirituality from the neck up, you know?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah.
you're a spiritual director. I am as well. And we, in spiritual direction, typically we'll do that in a space where we have some space to be quiet and sit still and listen and attend. But your work invites movement, and I just love to just even hear you say more about what happens to our awareness of God, even beyond just our awareness of self, when we begin to move instead of remain still.
Yes. Thank you. That's such a great question. And it's a really important question, especially for those who are trying to engage the contemplative life, right? And
Hmm.
the way that we often think about it for those of us who are white, who are upper class, middle class, who are yeah, in certain pockets of this contemplative community, we think of it as silence, stillness, and solitude.
Hmm.
But that doesn't work for everybody. And it's actually
Hmm.
not the complete understanding of how the contemplative life has worked in the Christian tradition. And especially for people who are neurodivergent, movement is really, really important. Again, because that's how we begin to process and regulate our senses and our emotions, especially when they get fired up and overstimulated in our worship services or,
Hmm.
in the mall or in our normal life, in our job, in our schools. So, part of the contemplative practices I want to introduce are reclaiming how movement can help us slow down
Hmm.
and also engage our bodies to be more attentive to what God is doing in us, to help us be less in survival mode and more in this posture of openness. So movement is really important. I think also community is really important. This book is a book that was written in community. It's in walks with other people, and I really hope that people will not just take solitary walks. I mean, that's great, but I hope they'll do this with others, find a walking partner and go through this as well. And also the sensory aspect has become, just really important part of my own sense of how God is communicating with us. When I sit with people in spiritual direction, I notice that people experience and hear from God in so many different ways. And so my job as a spiritual director really is to pay attention to what are the unique ways in which you are wired to connect with God. It may, be in different ways. And some people that I meet with need to move, especially if they're processing a lot of pain. We can't sit still. We need to get up and walk. And so we'll walk and do spiritual direction. Others, I will notice when I'm sitting with them, when they get activated and overwhelmed. And I don't want to diminish that or take them out of that place. There's a lot that we can discover about what God is doing and what God wants to heal in that. But when it comes to now doing the work of discernment or finding a way forward, we really do have to figure out how to become calm again, right? So there are different strategies I'm learning, just some breathing techniques we might do together. Some people might need to knit or, sit with some texture with them. So there's different ways in which people find it helpful to engage their bodies in the work of contemplation, which really is about learning to be with God in the most pure way that we can.
I love that. I love the opportunity to invite a directee to go on a walk instead of sit in my office if it's a particularly nice day. Just kind of encourage them to, remind them, God is a 3-mile-per-hour God, which is a
Yes.
great pace to have a good conversation and to notice things and to linger. And so I love that. It strikes me that it wasn't until I think I found my way in the spiritual direction. This would have been all after, this whole Haiti thing. Like that Haiti thing really opened up a lot of healing in me and kind of God just moving me in discerning ways to where I am now. And it wasn't until, my own spiritual direction training that I would have ever heard anybody say to me, let's take a moment and pause and notice notice what's happening in your body. Where are you
Yeah.
feeling tension? Or you just said that. Where do you feel that? How does that feel in your body, right? That was
Yes.
never something I would have ever been around through Bible college and all my early years in ministry. So it's something of a lost art form. It's something of a lost awareness of
Yeah.
the fullness of what we mean when we talk about our souls, right? And
Yes.
that I pick up in your book too as, spiritual wayfinding. I like how in the beginning of the book you do describe what a wayfinding or a wayfinder would be. Can you just share a little bit about that? Because that's another one of those places where it was a lost form of really knowing in your body, what's happening. So just share
Yes.
some of what you learned
Yes.
in that process.
Okay, and I might reveal myself as an Enneagram 5 here as a total
Yeah.
nerd, but bear with me. Yeah, I think wayfinding is so interesting because it's a way in which we figure out not just where we're going, but where we are with the wisdom of our bodies, right?
Mhm.
By noticing what's happening around us, where we are. There's a great line from Moana. I hope I can remember it, but he says, it's called Wayfinding Princess. It's knowing
Mm.
where we are and where we've been, so we know where we're going, something like that. And so wayfinding, I've just been really curious about how people found their way back before technology, right? And I'm really fascinated with, especially like the ancient Polynesian voyagers who could navigate the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean with like pinpoint accuracy just by knowing things like the map of the stars, which they memorize through dance, through feeling the waves in their body, that interoception, which is one of the sensory pieces that we don't really know about. You know, it's not one of the five, but it's a really important part of our sensory systems. And so there was just the way in which the human body has wisdom to know where we are, that we've lost. And I became curious about that. And I also became curious about, in the Middle Ages, they used this amazing device called an astrolabe, which I found in Uzbekistan when I was back in the ancient past, when I had a different career, which was filmmaking. And I was doing a project in Uzbekistan, and I discovered this astrolabe. And that one really fascinated me because that was kind of the precursor to the cell phone. And what happened was that the wayfinder no longer needed to memorize the star charts in their body through dance. Now they could hold it in their hand. And there was this little pin that kind of was like a "you are here" dot that told them where they are. So now they're holding the universe in their hand. And now discernment becomes about me at the center, and then the world around me. And that's really what has happened to so many of us. And now that we've got our cell phones, I never think about my place in the greater world. Now the world is around me, who is at the center of the universe. And I rarely look up, right? You go out in public and people are just got their heads down into their phone. They're not aware of where they are in the world, as being part of this bigger story around them. So really, that's kind of the big question mark I was holding on a meta level of like, how do we begin to lift our eyes and our gaze and find our place in the world again as part of the bigger story that God is still unfolding, instead of making it all about me and, what God is doing for me and, all my problems. And so that's how wayfinding came about for me, why it's so important for the work that we're doing, especially in spiritual direction.
I particularly loved how you mentioned that the Polynesian children would grow up like sitting in tide pools.
Yes.
And even at that young age, begin to feel how the tide affects them. And again, that just kind of, to me, speaks to what we have lost through a series of things. Technology is wonderful as it is, we're noticing what could potentially be lost, as well as even just that whole Enlightenment era of really like becoming thinking beings with bodies, right? And so back again to this idea of putting ourselves in a right, I think, position where it's not all about us. Andy Crouch is one who I love, who writes about this, and I remember him talking one time about just a simple spiritual practice, and I actually adapted it for a while. I'd like to bring it back, of just like before he picks up his cell phone in the morning, he would go outside and just spend even 30 seconds or a minute just being outside to look around. And I found it was really helpful for me to go out and actually touch the leaves on my tree.
Wow.
And still dark, or the sun's just barely coming up, but just have a moment where you just touch it. And the reason why he said he was doing that was that very thing, to have a different perspective. Instead of, I have the world in my hand with this phone and I feel really big.
Yeah.
put the phone down and actually your first experience in the morning is, I feel right-sized in this great
Yeah.
big universe. And
Yes.
so like that gets to, these two primary questions in your book. Who am I and where am I going? The idea of where have I been? Where am I now? Where am I going? Um, why are these important? Why are these questions so important to us in our spiritual life? And when I say spiritual life,
Mhm.
I do mean all of life.
All
Like
of
why are
life.
why are
Yeah.
these so important to us? Why do these
Yeah.
matter?
Yeah. I think they're the essential spiritual questions that we're
Yeah.
all asking. And because we're all looking to figure out, how do we fit in this world?
Mhm.
How do we matter, right? And what, in one of the meditations, we're actually making nature art. That's one of the meditations, is to go out and collect found
Mm.
items in nature and make nature art, which is so much fun to do with kids. And so we made this mandala. It was me and my two girls. And at the very center, it's good to put a centerpiece. And we had this beautiful pine cone at the center. And then we looked at that and we're like, yeah, it's kind of a mirror of our lives. And my youngest daughter said, well, if the pine cone is at the center, what should be at the center of our lives? And my oldest daughter said, well, it's human nature to put ourselves at the center, but we can't survive that kind of pressure. Like, that's too, she's very intellectual and mathematical,
Sounds like
like it's too much to hold the space at the
Mhm.
center for us. That's why we need God to be at the center. And I was like, what? Like, this is amazing, right? And it made me think of, like, even the way that God invited the Israelites to set up the camp with God at the center, and then everybody was radiating out from that. And I think that's the reality, is that
Mhm.
we're so often tempted to live our lives from the center,
Mhm.
and it's too much. There's too much pressure. There's too much weight on us, and so to discover that we are part of something bigger,
Mhm.
something meaningful, and to find our place in that is it's grounding.
Mhm.
It's deeply grounding, and it helps us, I think, be able to attend to what God is inviting us to. And it may just be the small things, and that's what's more important. Attend to the small things each day,
Mhm.
the small invitations, and be part of that long journey with God, um, walking it out. Yeah.
When we talk about, again, some neurodivergent space here, and even the ideas of inclusion, you know,
Mm.
um, how might we, the body of Christ, there's that body language, um, be unintentionally excluding folks by privileging, certain ways of engaging God versus others? Like, what can we do to pay attention to that and to be more intentional, I would say.
Yeah, that is such a great question, and such an important one.
Mhm.
I think that I forgot to look at this, just the most current statistics before the podcast, but you can look them up. I mean, do a Google search to see what's the rate in which people who are neurodivergent choose not to go to church. Why are they not showing up? And then we've got all their families that are now having a hard time attending church. Um, and and to become curious about that, I think that's the first step, is to become aware. Um, for many neurodivergent families, we use this term, that we attend church of the lobby, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Which means that we'll try really hard to bring our families in, but when they start acting up and people think that they have bad behavior problems, they're not recognizing they're having a hard time processing the sensory input.
Mhm.
And so it's not safe for them to stay in that space. And it's actually, what was really hard for us was to recognize that keeping our daughter in worship in the way that it was done in the church that we were at for years, the church that we loved and we knew everyone, was malforming her spiritually. It was now a place where she was dysregulated. She was, she was acting out, and that's not who she actually is. This was her survival. She's in survival mode. And so that's the experience that many people are having. And it's an invisible disability. It's not one that you can solve by meeting ADA standards, which we need to do a better job of. So paying attention, I think, and becoming curious when you see families, struggling to show up. If you see families in the lobby, pay attention to that. After church, if you notice kids running around like crazy, if they throw their bodies into each other, if they're stomping around, they are trying to engage their proprioceptive system in order to regulate sensory overwhelm. They're not bad kids. Pay attention to those things. And then I think beginning to work with families to ask, what are the sensory needs here? Is the music too loud? What do we do about the lights? Just pay attention to what's happening on a sensory level. One thing that was helpful for our family was to use this code of like green is like when we're in a state of peace. Blue is when we're not having enough stimulation, right? We get into the blue zone. We need a little more stimulation here. Yellow is like happy, and that's fun. And most churches want to try to keep everyone in this fun, happy yellow space. But that space, when it's not regulated, will go into a red space, which is when you have your meltdowns and when you can't return to this equilibrium so easily. So we began to just notice what's the energy level of this space when we walk in, and we would use those colors. And that can be helpful for churches to kind of pay attention. Do you really want to be in a yellow space all the time? What would it be like to actually normalize the green space, right? And so a lot of people who are neurodivergent really love sensory-based worship spaces. They're drawn to some of the ancient practices that are sensory friendly, that they engage their body. There's good smells. It's not overwhelming. There are things that they can do that's beyond just their mind. So those are just some beginning steps for gaining some curiosity about what's going on in your community and beginning to ask some questions about it. And also it's helpful to recognize, and I just want to say this one more plug, is to revisit the Old Testament ways of worship. They were sensory rich. They were not meant to overwhelm you, but they were engaged. All the worship forms were meant to engage the body and community. So, paying attention to what would be sensory rich and sensory friendly is helpful.
Yeah. So if you have neurodivergent, there's the other language of like what you would call maybe neurotypical, right? What might neurotypical people need to actually unlearn in order to receive the wisdom of neurodivergent experience? Absolutely.
Yeah, I think we have to unlearn. I asked this to my daughter early on in one of our walks. And I remember she was just walking backwards next to me, with the wind kind of coming through her hands, as she stretched them out. And I said, what do you want neurotypical people to know about, what the experience is for neurodivergent people? And she made the comment, it was her observation that neurotypical people tend to get stuck in their minds a lot. They have a lot of thoughts about God.
And you call that abstract, right?
Yes. Yes. We tend to be very abstract in our spirituality. And she's looking for an actual experience of God through the way God designed us to experience God, through our bodies, through our sensory system, through our emotions, to notice how God is moving with us and helping us find our way forward through those experiences. So, yeah, that was really helpful for me to realize, yeah, I am in my head a lot. Thoughts about God, thoughts about Christianity, thoughts about spirituality. What would it look like to engage in the way she does? And I think it's closer to what God had in mind all along.
Yeah. Thank you for that. You also have some helpful hints and ideas for folks who may not be able to walk. As we talk about, this wonderful way of engaging with God through walking, we also have to recognize. I even have my own mom has just had back surgeries and hip surgeries and issues that make it so walking is very painful for her. But you do offer some other alternatives. Can you share even some of those with us now?
Oh yeah, there's so many. I think the beauty of walking is that we talked earlier, it's bilateral, right?
Yeah.
Engages both
Okay.
sides of the body. So anything that you can do to engage both sides of the body. Some people like to knit or crochet.
Okay.
Other people like to do artwork or um, really there's endless things that you can experiment with, whatever is something that you enjoy.
Mm-hmm.
I when I was early in writing this book, my stepfather had a stroke and became paralyzed, except for the use of one of his hands. And he
Mm-hmm.
was a walker. He loved to walk and he loved to be outside. And so what the family did was make sure that he was positioned next to a window where he could watch everything go by. And so there's something about even lifting the chin and looking at the horizon. That's one of the
Okay.
walks, is looking at the horizon. Even that simple act has incredible benefits on the body. And one of the other things he liked to do was they gave him, they tied like a band on his bedside and they put knots in it. And he spent his time unknotting it. And that was something that he could do.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that's actually the same thing as walking a labyrinth. It's just a single line through that's winding through, right? And so he had a way of walking a labyrinth just by unknotting this rope that was with him. He was able to process and engage his interior state physically in that small way. So there's lots of ways. I mean, even listening to music that has binaural beats, you can look that up. That's the music kind of shifts from the right side to the left side.
Okay.
It's very calming. It's great for if you have tinnitus. That's how I discovered it. But again, it engages both sides of the brain. So these are things you can do to kind of engage your body, and then play around with prayer as you are doing these kinds of activities. How is God with you?
Yeah.
How do you want to be with God?
Oh, Deb, thank you so much. I'm glad that you said you were an Enneagram 5 because it lets me off the hook a little bit as an Enneagram 4. I'm blown away by how smart you are and how much wisdom you're pouring into this. But it's not just head knowledge, it is embodied wisdom and experience through your own life, through your life with your children. And this book is a gift to all who read it. And I am so excited to have this now in not just to sit on my shelf, but to maybe buy cases of, and encourage
Yes.
directees to have these, and encourage people who go on pilgrimages. And we lead a retreat at Life Point called the Sacred Way Retreats. And I mean, wayfinding and actual, this will probably be in their gift bags at our retreats this
Oh,
year. So
thank
I just
you.
can't say enough thank you for bringing your wisdom, your embodied wisdom, really, and your walk with God into this space. No wonder IVP was like, yes, let's do this. Let's do this with you. Yes. So, man, Thank you. Um,
Thanks, Adam.
as someone gets up today to go for a walk, but they haven't got the book yet, what might it look for them to just take an ordinary walk and turn it into a moment of prayerful awareness? What can they do
Yeah.
today?
I think my favorite and the easiest walk is to take an awe walk.
Mm,
And that's just to slow down enough to look for something that catches your eye and makes you feel a little bit of awe. It could be a spider web. It could just be the way the roots poke out of the ground, just to connect you to this sense of living in this vast universe
mhm,
and yet being able to be so close and connected to it.
mhm.
So, yeah, try an awe walk. Just
Okay.
open yourself to awe.
All
See
right.
what you discover.
All right, Deb. Thank you. I guess one last question I would ask would be: is there anything that you really hope people will ask you about this book?
Oh boy. Um, I I don't know if I want them to ask me much. I really want them to tell me their stories of
Okay, cool.
walking.
Yeah. So
That's what
you
I
want the
love to
engagement?
hear.
Yes. Yes.
I do. I love to hear the stories because everyone has walking stories or
Hmm.
movement stories or some kind of
Hmm.
embodied story that is
Hmm.
meaningful for them in their walk with God.
Hmm. Wonderful. Well, Deb, thanks so much for being with us today on the Being Formed podcast. What a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam.
Well, Deborah Gregory, thank you so much. This feels like one of those conversations, just inviting us into something we don't need to manufacture. Once again, what would it be like to just receive? As you go from here, I want to offer something simple. Take a walk, not to get somewhere, not to accomplish anything, just to be present. Notice your body, notice your surroundings. Notice what's happening within you, and as you walk, you might simply ask, God, where are you right now? Don't try to force an answer. Just pay attention, because often God's already present, waiting to be noticed. And maybe that's part of what it means to be formed, learning over time to recognize God's presence in the middle of our actual lives. So friends, keep walking the path. Christ is with you, and you are being formed. Until next time, grace and peace.